EJ, thank you so much for joining me on the Emil podcast. It's wonderful to have you on board.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
It's good to pick your brain today because many of our audience may or may not have heard of the work that you do and the kind of things that interest you. You're a writer, you're also a teacher, and you've got a varied experience in a whole range of different things that I've come to appreciate. So what I would do is I'll get you to give our audience a bit of an introduction, who you are and what it is that you do, and then we'll kick it off from there.
Oh, sure. So my name's Ebony-Jane Carroll, but everybody calls me EJ, especially children. That's much easier for them to pronounce. I started as a kindergarten teacher, and I actually never wanted anything to do with children. I sort of fell into it because I didn't get into journalism, would you believe? And I ended up falling in love with early childhood. So I did my bachelor degree whilst I worked through childcare centres. And then I ended up doing my master's on top of that, especially in inclusion and early intervention, because a lot of children had additional needs and I didn't feel like my undergrad prepared me for that. So I just kept doing more study, and it was quite fascinating. And then at the same time working in the field, I got to put, all the theory into application, and then that led into wanting to write children's books. I've always wanted to be an author, but I never thought I'd end up writing children's books. And when you're around them, the ideas sort of just spark and you get the creativity. So now I've done 3 books, and it's sort of, I work at a university as well, helping teachers become teachers. I've dabbled in a bit of lecturing around child behaviour. That's just the unit that fell my way. So obviously I delved into that, and so I don't have children of my own yet, but I've spent about 10 years hanging around people under 5, so I understand them pretty well.
It's very underrated. It's very overrated having children of your own. Kidding. They're darlings. Depending on the type of day. There's an interesting discussion that I had heard. I can't remember who the person was, but she was in the car with her teenage son, and she's recording, and she's saying, the teenage son is like, "Mum, who do you love the most, me or my sister?" And she's like, "That's actually a really, really easy question for me to answer. I love both of yous, but the person I like the most is the person who's not annoying me at that particular point in time. So I can say I don't like you in one particular point, but I still love you, depending on how you're making me feel." And so it's kind of like that, having kids when they completely irritate you in one area, and you can, it works both ways. I can completely irritate my kids as well, and they can get annoyed with me. So it's a matter of love and like.
Yeah.
You've written a few books. Can you walk our audience through the books that you have written, starting with their titles and what it is that what they cover?
Sure. So the first book, I'll just hold it up so you can see it. This one here. It's called Eggs. And this one I published in 2014. So that's been out for a while.
Oh, wow.
And that book is about 6 eggs who all have a dream to be something different. So, scrambled in a cake, in a fight, and one wants to be an Easter egg, which is seemingly impossible. And all the way through the story, everyone else sort of gets their dream, and you've got the mean egg that's, whispering in his ear, "You'll never get what you want. You'll never be what you want to be." So I sort of feel like I'm that egg that always wanted to be the author but couldn't quite get there, and all the self-doubt and all the self-talk, and then also other people. So it's really for children to look within themselves and just go for it and be who they know they are on the inside, regardless of the voices. And that book, look, it turned out to be more popular than I thought it would be. I get emails, messages from all over the place saying, "Can we have a second copy? We've worn it out," or "It's always borrowed out at the library." It took about a year of people saying that to me before I believed it was that good. So I was published in the Herald Sun with it when it came out. I've been at a local festival reading it up on one of those huge big cinema screens, and so I've travelled all around Melbourne with this book in schools, and it's always quite popular. So that was my first one.
And just as an aside, you recently did an interview with Discernible with the host Matt, and you read the book out on his show. So any audience who might want to look at that, they can always access that interview. But yeah, continue on.
Yeah, you can go and see that one. So the second one I did is called Melancholy Dolly, and it looks like this. And I didn't say this to Matt on the show, but this is actually a nursery rhyme, and so it's a bit of it's an old-fashioned nursery rhyme style, but it's modernized. So I've got things in there like she wanted to eat Jamie Oliver food, and and she wanted to be like Einstein smart. So yeah, it's kind of quirky nursery rhyme style, and the illustrations in that are awesome. The person I chose to do that is this wonderful Russian lady who lives a few suburbs away.
Can you hold it up again? I love the front cover of that. That's really cool. That's really good.
Yeah, I can show you a picture from the inside.
Yeah, please.
Something a bit quirky if you want.
So for those of you who are listening to this, the visuals will be on the YouTube video, so we'll kind of go from there. But EJ's just showing me parts of the book, and on the front cover there's a picture of a how do you describe it? A doll that's kind of almost got a curious but troubled look on her face, and she's just kind of staring almost past you. It looks.
So I've taken sort of metaphors and made them sort of come to life in the book. So if you're being bullied at school, for example, it's a bull.
All right, that's smart.
Yeah. So the book, the book's all written in rhyme, and it walks a doll through the life of a real girl, and it shows that she wants to be like a real girl. She wants to have the ups and downs of life. She doesn't want to always get the right answer in class, and maybe she's embarrassed, or there's something that she wants and she can't have. So it's a perfect doll longing for a real life, because I think little girls look at Barbie and they think, oh, that's a perfect doll. Whereas, a life that's not perfect is better than a fake one. So that's sort of the message I'm trying to get across in that book.
Was that a purposeful message that you were looking at?
That was, and I went on, I was telling Matt, you should never write a story with the moral in mind. That one, I was more interested in the quirky creativity part of it. So that did lead me, but it definitely does have a strong message in it for girls, especially for girls. Yeah.
I think it's huge and very important in our day and age to be able to espouse that self-confidence. And the self-confidence is, I was telling a client this recently, that there's a bit of a distinction between self-confidence and perceived confidence, where that self-confidence is a thing that comes from within, and we have the ability to believe that we have not just the know-how, but the motivation and the ability to do something. And the perceived confidence, you can always come across as confident. A very simple way of coming across as confident is tilting your head back and putting your shoulders back and chest out. That's what lobsters do. That's what other types of mammals do. I mean, you look at a lion, for example, when it roars, it kind of sits up, puts its paws down and just lets it go. This is just something that our, not just our species, but many species can emulate that. But you wouldn't call a lion, unless it's Scar in The Lion King, a insecure animal. So that sense, having that inner internal confidence, that's a really important theme. So sorry to take a
that's okay. I was just thinking, my dogs seem to have that confidence when we walk past bigger dogs, and I just think this dog's going to eat you alive, but for some reason they're very confident. And you'll probably really like this one. My last book at the moment is called The Yellow Leaf.
Okay.
So,
That's good. So for those who are listening, there's a yellow leaf that's flowing in the wind with a forest behind of naked trees, a log at the back with a hat and
a scarf.
And a scarf. Okay.
So these are the belongings of two people who have died. So this is this belongs to a little boy, and this belongs to somebody's mum. And so the characters in the book, they find each other, and they're carrying the belongings that belong to the people that have passed away that they love. Wow. And they're going through the forest of grief. And so in that book, all the colours change as they move through the forest. So I don't specifically use the word anger or sadness because I want people to be able to label their own emotions. I'm not going to tell you that you have to feel angry or you have to feel sad when somebody dies. It's up to, you know, your own grief process. But you can tell though when they're moving through red, it's a feeling of anger. When they're moving through orange, it's a feeling of fear, and yellow is sadness. But then the amazing thing about this book, because I worked with a child bereavement counsellor, is that grief isn't linear. So, you know, you can have a day where you're quite okay and you're happy and you laugh, and then you might feel guilty that you laughed, you know, and you don't know why. How am I okay today, but I'm not okay tomorrow? So there's bursts of green throughout the forest, which shows that you can be, you know, having this memory of this person and laughing, but then it can turn into tears. And it's to help parents understand as well that just because their child is running around and playing, it doesn't mean they're over something, just because they're having a good moment. And as they go, the children collect leaves of the colours of their feelings, and they weave them into the hat and they weave them into the scarf. And it's a representation of the heart and the mind and what you might be going through. So it's not like you get to the end of the story and everything's better and, you know, you're over this grief. It's just to show you that there's no perfect way to grieve. There's a different timeline for everybody. It's not linear. And, you know, you might feel angry the whole time and that's how you do it, or you might feel no anger at all. So it's to normalize that there is no normal. You know, there's no normal sort of way to do it, and everyone's going to be different. Yeah,
that's really powerful. I mean, I feel very somber just hearing you relay that, and to do something like that for children, that's a huge move, and I thank you for that, because that creates a way of opening up a discussion that kids in particular are very inequipped to make sense of it at times, and even parents, depending on their relationship with death, are inequipped to handle.
Yeah, and they don't have to say anything either. They can just read the book, go to sleep, and then maybe, you know, in a week or a month they'll want to talk about it. But just at least having that discussion and opening it up, because I know, for example, I've dedicated the book to my dad. He lost his dad when he was 7 in an accident, and no one ever spoke to him about it. He never went to the funeral. He never got closure. It was sort of, let's move on, and not being able to process that as a child, you know, that can still carry on for the rest of your life. So I think, I just think people don't know how to help sometimes when somebody dies. It can be an awkward feeling. It can be a feeling of hopelessness. You know, what do I do here? So this is a resource. This is a tool for people to use.
As you were speaking, EJ, I had a memory come up in my mind of the first time I remember coming across death as a child, quite a young child. I think I would have been under 10 years of age. And I'd gone to a funeral that my parents brought me to. And it was of a relatively young lady who had children that were my age. So that she was probably in her 30s or 40s, who had just died. And her daughter was one of my friends, and they were in the same community that I was in. And I remember going up to her, and I asked her, I'm like, how does it feel that your mum has died? And then she burst into tears and kind of ran off. And I remember the way that my parents handled that at the time was by chastising me for asking those questions. And I thought at the time, and I'm thinking back at it now, that it's just not okay to talk about that sort of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And even though I was a curious kid, I just wanted to know the story behind what's going on. In retrospect, I can understand how the response was, but at the time, it's difficult to comprehend. So having a book like that, for example, would have been very, very helpful.
Yeah. And you've just brought up a memory for me, actually. I remember teaching kindergarten one year, and there was a 4-year-old boy who I was having trouble bonding with. He just had problems at home, and it didn't matter what I did, I just sort of couldn't build a relationship with him. And then in the same week, both his grandmother and my grandmother died. And so he came to kinder one day and told me that, and I said, that's funny, my grandmother's just died as well. And then the two of us were inseparable for the rest of the year. We just had this bond over it. And it's so funny how things like that happen, because then it was like the two of us could understand each other in a way that nobody else could. And so sometimes, and that's what I talked to Matt on Discernible. We were talking about lockdown being this horrible thing, but it's also brought people closer together. And I'm just trying to find the silver lining and the sunshine in it all, because if you don't do that, you'll go crazy.
I think you're onto something, EJ. I've just finished writing a book on the history of traumatic stress, because I try to find a book like that tracks when history first begins to document trauma, psychological trauma, and I wasn't able to find it. So I'm like, I might as well go ahead and do the research myself and write a book on it myself. And so I covered trauma from 2.5 million years ago, back to one of our ancestors, our non-human ancestors, up until the death of Jesus. So it's around the trauma before the current era began. And the way the book ended was almost exactly how you discuss it. I ended on a note that trauma without meaning leads to desperation, distress, and overall post-traumatic stress. Whereas trauma that has meaning assigned to it, where you can draw some meaning out of it, leads to post-traumatic growth. And post-traumatic growth is a concept that has been studied by psychologists for some time now, except it's overtaken by the shadow of post-traumatic stress. And that's where the research usually is assigned to. So I wonder if we switched that conversation and said, what can we draw out of this? And how can we move forward from this? The experience of this type of distress would be turned on its head. So it's a good point that you bring up, EJ.
I sort of I've had to train myself out of thinking, why me? Why did this happen to me? It's not fair. That was my mentality a lot as a child. It's not fair. But life happens to everybody, and if it's already happened and it's going to happen, then I want to try and make something positive out of it, because I think that's a choice. I think it's a choice to stay positive about things. I don't think people who walk around just have it easier. Someone who goes to the gym, for example, it's not like they're just fit. They put the work in, and so people have to put the work in. You only get out what you put in. So it's taken me a long time to learn that, though. I was very much always wanting things to just happen for me. But,
I definitely relate to that, and I see it in the therapy room. It's often people who have been through a lot of stress that can have that untrustworthy, and I'm not saying this is where you're, I don't know much about where you've come from, but in the therapy room, it's a matter of identifying the lack of trust that often people have in others if they've experienced a lot of stress themselves. And when that trustlessness comes in, it can often lead to hopelessness and helplessness. And the lack of control is the big key. The more and more I keep practicing, the more I understand that trauma is rooted in a lack of control. And that's why people feel like they can overcome their trauma when they engage in activities that gives them control. So for example, it could be, that's why martial arts or things like shooting or going or just rough and tumble play gives a person that stress, but it's a bounded stress. It's boundaries, and you work within your area of competence there. And it's actually a really interesting one because it builds the prefrontal fibers within the brain that allows for regulation, self-regulation, growth, future thinking, the ability to connect with other people, the ability to understand what's happening within our bodies, and then to apply that into what we're going to do within our actions. It's a bloody intricate process, but it rests upon control. And when we feel we've lost control, how many of us say, I'm bloody out of control, my emotions are just out of control right now? And then we do something, whether it's writing. For me, it was writing. When I was a kid, I would write all the time, and that's just continued to stay on. And so I can identify with Melancholy Dolly, where I have another memory of writing a particular story when I was in primary school. And then my brother comes into the room, and my oldest brother, which I didn't really talk too much at that time. He kind of kept to himself, and he would read a lot and that sort of stuff. He said, "Why do you write these pointless stories? They're never going to get you anywhere." And that just stood with me for the longest time until I changed that. And I'm like, actually, I enjoy writing. I'm not writing to get anywhere. And if it gets anywhere, it would happen through an evolving process. But that's a bit of we've taken an aside there, but I just wanted to circle back to what you just said, that silver lining, that ability to control, and how that related to you in lockdowns. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I do jiu-jitsu, but I don't think until now I've sort of realized why I love it so much, until, it's a control thing. It's exhilarating. I just went there for a free session, and I just always wanted to test it out. I listened to so much Joe Rogan that I thought, right, I'm going to this jiu-jitsu because he never shuts up about it. And the first session, the trainer pulls you aside if you're new and teaches you how to get out of a wrist lock. And once you can do it, you sort of think, oh, I want to know what else I can do. And then you pair up with someone, and everyone is so supportive, and they want you to get better. And then someone attacks you, then you're the attacker, and you walk out of there and you think, what have I just done for an hour? This was the coolest, most bizarre thing in the world. And then you want to get your first belt and your second belt, and you can see it progressing. And there's just so much to learn. You'll just never stop learning. But I think what happens is, when you're there, you have to be so focused on your technique and making sure you don't get choked out and tapping someone to say, I'm passing out here. But you can't focus on your own problems, or you can't focus on what's going on in the world, because you're right in that moment. And I think it's like a bit of a mental break from everything else. So I've read articles saying it's sort of like yoga for the mind. It's a stress release. It's fun. And I think you actually do that, and then you realize you need to do yoga because you realize how inflexible you are. So then you probably get another addiction and start doing yoga or something. But I almost can't explain why I love it, but I wish I'd started it as a kid. And if I'm lucky enough to have children, I would definitely put them in martial arts. It's something that I would recommend, especially if you don't have self-confidence, or if it's something you think you could never do and it just doesn't sound like you at all, you're the perfect person to do jiu-jitsu.
Oh, you touched on something so important. I will circle back to it for our listeners who are just tuning in now in terms of this interview, maybe the first interview. I have interviewed a couple practitioners of mixed martial arts in my podcast, where they go through, one is a psychotherapist and a double black belt in a range of different martial arts, and she talks about the psychology of martial arts. And then I have another practitioner who talks about confidence and mixed martial arts, and he's gone around the world and was trained by the person who was friends with Bruce Lee, and he's got his name engraved in the same place that Bruce Lee and the Ip Man and the rest of them have their name engraved in China. And it really, Damien Chaudemutu is his name. Now, what you talk about is really pivotal there, because you're going through the jiu-jitsu side of things, where jiu-jitsu as a grappling art, and I'll call it an art because it really is, it's a sport as well as an art. I suspect that one of the reasons why you and many others may find it so, I can't think of a better word than helpful at the moment, is because there's not just the thing that you're trying to get out of. So let's say a choke or an arm bar or a wrist lock or what have you. What you're given are the tools in how you might go about doing it. And so that creates a level of confidence and saying, I know what to do right now. And if I practice it enough, then I'm going to get bloody good at this.
Yeah. Yeah. Also, it takes me about 3 or 4 times for someone to feed me the move for it to click in my brain. So the first time I do a new, I suppose the word's move that you would use, or defense, mm-hmm. I'm so awkward. I'm like, I have no idea where to put my leg. I feel like I don't know how to hold that person's arm, and I just feel really quite stupid, to be honest. Mm-hmm. And it just blows my mind, because it's kinesthetic intelligence. My body isn't used to having to think that way. And so I suppose it's sort of like learning another language or a musical instrument. My brain's not wired that way either. I'm more linguistic. So mm-hmm. forcing myself into a new sphere, it's actually helped me it's helped me with writing. It's helped me with social things. I don't know, it just opens your brain up to another side of yourself. And that's why I see when children do it, they're there to learn the skill, but then it actually reflects in their social life in school, or their ability to do a subject at school they weren't doing well in. They just have this inner confidence. It just blows my mind how amazing the sport is.
Yeah, and that kinesthetic awareness is really, really important. From a neurobiological point of view, you have a proprioceptive awareness, where proprioception is the perception of how you fit in time and space. If you're moving your arms around and you have some good proprioceptive awareness, you know where your arms are going in time and space at that point in time. Whereas if there's something wrong with that part of the brain and you're moving your arm up, you won't be able to pick that as it goes. But what that forces you to do is it forces you to pay attention to your body. And then you get the interoceptive awareness, which interoception is perception of what's happening inside your body. And if you're anything like me and kind of up here a lot, and you're kind of thinking and you're more logical, the interoceptive awareness comes a little bit more difficult for you. But through a mixed martial arts, you need to be proprioceptive, you need to be interoceptive, you need to understand how your body is working so that you can get that submission, so that you can get out of that lock that they might put forward. That's huge.
And also the rules are so strange. Like if you're being attacked, for example, the best thing to do is move forward and move closer to the attacker, because then you have the advantage. And the first time I heard that, I thought, no, the goal is to get away. But there's certain positions that you can put someone in that it looks like you're in danger, but it's actually the other way around. You've got control, depending on, it's just amazing to me. So it also just sort of messes up your idea of the world a little bit. I don't know. It's a good thing to do for self-development. I would just recommend it to everybody.
And you touched on something important there, EJ, when you said when you're leaning into the if you're what were the words you used? If somebody's got you, you want to move forward into it so that you can shift, change the rules of the game. I remember counseling a pilot some years ago, and what he said was that if you're in a storm and there's your plane is starting to kind of lose its stability, you don't want to pull against the yoke. You want to lean into where the storm is directing you until you get to an altitude that you can pull it back up. And in counseling and in therapy, that's what we do. It's a matter of safely and with a level of bounded awareness and having those boundaries in place to lean into the discomfort and to move out. As Jordan Peterson would say, the greatest reward is to be found where you least want to look, something like that. And it's a really interesting process. But we kind of diverged a lot around from your books. I want to jump back into it. I do apologize for that, but we got lost into conversation. You were talking about The Yellow Leaf as your third book.
Mm-hmm. Yep. So that's a grief book. Look, I'm in two minds about reading that to children who haven't lost somebody. I think that's up to the parent. Some parents want children to be aware of death and open and talking about it before they experience their first loss, and other parents want to protect their children from knowing about that, and they'll wait until it happens and then they'll use that as the time to teach them about it. So I would leave that up to parents. Parents know their children best, and that's a huge that's a part of early childhood framework in curriculum, is that at the end of the day, no matter what we're teaching in kinder or what the curriculum says, parents are the ones who know their children best. So you know how they might react better than I would. Like I might know them for a year, but you've had them since birth. So a good example would be the child bereavement counsellor has taught me a lot of things through doing this book together. And one question a lot of parents have is, should my child go to a funeral? And her response is, ask the child what they would like to do. Depending, if they're toddler age, they're not really going to know what's going on anyway. But so I knew three brothers. They were sort of aged, I think, 7, 5 and 3, and someone really close to them died, and 2 wanted to go to the funeral and 1 didn't. And so the parents respected that, and they went with that, and that's how they did it. So yeah, that's one sort of thing that I've learned through this whole process, is you need to ask children what they're feeling, don't just assume.
Yeah, it's a bit more of a nuanced conversation, isn't it?
Yeah, it's not an easy thing to do at all. So that's why we need resources, I think.
Yeah, and for you to be able to provide those resources, I don't recall having this sort of stuff when I was growing up. I was born in 1990, so I grew up on the Famous Five and Narnia and the kids' books that I enjoyed. They didn't seem. I mean, Narnia is way more complex than we think, than we give it credit for. And when I look back at it as an adult, I start to see why I like those books so much. Did you read Narnia as a kid?
I did. Yeah, love Narnia. Yeah.
Which one was your favorite?
Oh, I'm not going to be able to give you a name. Do you know? I did read them, but I was much more into Goosebumps, would you believe? You remember R.L. Stein and Enid Blyton, the Enid Blyton series. I read every single one of her books. Yep. I cannot remember the name of a Narnia one though.
So the reason I asked that question is because I started to notice why the title, the book that I liked the most what the reason was that I liked it as an adult rather than when I was a kid. So my favorite book from Narnia was The Horse and His Boy. And that happened without the main characters predominantly. It was a boy called Shasta who was a king's son, but he was washed up during a battle, and an old peasant man brought him up. And so it kind of emulates the story of there was a guy who went against what's her name, Medusa. I can't remember in the Greek lore, but he ended up he had the same story. So C.S. Lewis picked up on a lot of those themes and put them into his book. But this Shasta boy was brought up by an evil man, and then at one point he met, when he was a kid, he met a traveling warrior who came and lodged at his father's house. And then he was kind of listening in on the conversation, and they were starting to talk about selling him, finding ways to just, they were bargaining on a price. And then the horse that the stranger came in on started to talk and said, hey, if you want to escape, let's go together. And that horse wanted to go back to his own land, which was Narnia, and they were in another land, and they get on board and have all sorts of adventures and go back to that. And I didn't know why I liked that, but I was listening to a lot of those books as an audiobook. And then later on, I'd be like, well, growing up, I always wanted to escape. I wanted to find ways to have a better life than I did at the time. And I'm not saying that my upbringing was a terrible upbringing. My parents are amazing, and I love the way that they are. We've got a great relationship right now. But as a child, my perception wasn't, my experience wasn't the best in certain elements, and it was great in other elements. But what I would say is, in retrospect, that's what happened. For you, it's you consider things like Goosebumps, you consider things like Inner Blind Book, The Secret Seven, Famous Five, those real awesome adventures that they get into. These books shape us as children, and when we look back at them, it's like, oh, that's what I remember growing up to. Was that your experience?
Yeah, I always sort of wonder why, I gravitate towards a certain thing. And with Goosebumps, I would open up the book and think, what on earth, what sort of fantasy land am I going to be taken down? I was just excited by the craziness of it, or how far can my imagination go? So I think I get drawn to those sorts of things, which is probably reflected in eggs. Like, who writes a book about eggs wanting to be cracked open and thrown around in a cake and with a face on it? It's sort of it's wild. Kids just think it's wild that and then I get photos from parents that they've drawn all over the egg cartons at home, and they put faces on all the eggs. So cool. I think the imagination for me, that would be, I'd probably be the child at kinder in the playing cats and dogs, playing anything, sort of creating games, creating mums and dads, all those sort of imaginary games. I wouldn't be the one sort of doing the puzzle or the blocks or anything. And I'm still terrible at maths now. So, you just gravitate towards what you like, I suppose.
That's true. Yeah. And what may keep in memory for you may not necessarily be the one that influenced somebody else as an adult, as a child rather.
Yeah.
How interested would you be to read the book Eggs to our audience, just to give people a little bit of a snippet onto your style of writing, and then we can take off from there?
I'm happy to read it. You want me to read it right now on air?
I'd love to hear it, and I'd love to present that to our audience because of the themes that I think we we can continue to come across as we move on in this interview.
Okay, so I'm hoping you can see it all right.
I can see it fine. The lighting is perfect.
Okay, good. All right, so this is Eggs by EJ Carroll, illustrated by Emmy Ojala. I think that's how you pronounce her name. She lives in Amsterdam, Emmy. Okay. The chicken pen rarely got a second look, with its water bowl straw and nosy chook. If anyone ruffled through the feathers, they would find buried golden treasures. Picked up and put in a basket to hold, 6 warm eggs were about to get cold. Huddled in the dark, it would seem that each egg found its very own dream. That's a little bit scary in there, a little bit dark.
It is quite dark. For those who are listening, there's a very dark image with some shining eggs, but everything else is quite dark in that fridge.
The thing that I want most is to be poached on toast. I want to slip and slide, so I hope that I get fried. It's got the sunnies on there in the fry pan, the Ray-Bans.
That's clever.
I would be just tickled if I could end up pickled. I want to mix and bake, so I hope I'm in a cake. I hope you can see her in there.
Ah, you can see her face in a cake slice.
Yeah.
It's smiling. She's got aspirations. Interesting.
I'm hoping someone might put me in a fight. Now, I don't want to beg, but can I be an Easter egg? And you can see over here with the raw WWE World Wrestling eggs with the smashed egg. It's a little bit dark, like I said. The egg that was green began to be mean. You can't be an Easter egg. What a silly dream. The fridge door opened and 3 were taken, cooked and served with bread and bacon. The room was filled with smells so yummy that it all went into someone's tummy. 2 eggs waited to become delicious, while the other egg waited to be vicious. The sad egg thought about what was said, let out a sigh and hung its head. The happy egg smiled and gave it a squeeze. Have some faith, you've got to believe. Into a bowl of butter and flour went the egg that was baked within an hour. Now something happened during the night to the egg that wanted to be in a fight. A horrible smell began rising within. It stank so much it needed the bin. The mean egg turned completely rotten. In the rubbish it went, right down to the bottom. The last lonely egg sat there for weeks, while tear after tear rolled down its cheeks. One day, without warning, the door swung open. The egg closed its eyes and prepared to be broken. Crack! Was someone sneaky playing a joke? The shell was split, but there was no yolk. Crunch! A watering mouth began to eat and realised it tasted nice and sweet. No, this was not a devious stunt, just a leftover egg from an Easter egg hunt. Cleverly hidden beneath the straw, it was mistaken for the eggs that were raw. The chocolate egg smiled, for its dream had come true. It was always an Easter egg, but it never knew. Did you?
I've got to admit, no, I did not. That's clever. I love it. I love it. We need to get these stories out more to a wider and wider audience.
It's, you know what, I've learned this watching American Idol, Australian Idol, you know, whatever it might be. There's a lot of talented people. There's a lot of people who can do things, but it's such a competitive market world. Marketing is everything. Getting your name out there, getting your voice out there. You have to keep doing posts. You have to keep talking about it. You have to keep pushing it, selling it. And it's just not in my nature. I just like doing the creative writing part, and I get so exhausted by the promotional side, but then it will just sit and it won't sell. And so I think for people who want to do something like write or have a product, to know going into it that it's almost more work to try and sell it after you've made it. If you think that it's just going to sell itself because it's good, maybe once in a blue moon you might get lucky like that, but most people have to slog it out. And it's not because it's not a good product necessarily. It's just that there's so many voices out there, and you've got to start yelling louder than them.
It sounds like you're doing something that you love, that you're really good at, evidently. So you're really good at putting together stories. And even though you weren't trying to teach the message or a moral over there, it kind of came out in the way that you put the book together. And that's huge. That's a beautiful, beautiful little stories. And I can't wait to hear the other stories. We'll leave them for now, but we'll give instructions on where our listeners can get your books towards the end of this episode. You talked a little bit about the writing process with Matt on his interview, on his podcast. Can you tell our listeners how you approach an idea, putting words together, and how the story comes to you? Do you have a process?
I think art is a bit messy. I think you sort of don't know what you're doing as you're going. Like at the moment, I'm writing an animation screenplay for children. So, you know, like a Shrek or a Lion King, that sort of a thing. I won't say what it is, but I'm doing that. And whenever I get an idea or a line or a character trait or something, I just write it down, and it's just a pile of mess right now. It's not like you sit down and start writing this perfect story. I might see a scene in my head and just write the scene, but I don't know where that's going to fit in. I don't know if it's going to be the start or the end, but I can sort of see the general idea. And I would sort of liken it, this is for me personally, to putting one of those huge puzzles together. You know, you might start with the corner pieces, and then you might see something to go right in the middle, and then eventually it will start looking like something. But for me to sit down and just write from start to finish and it all flows perfectly, it just never works like that. You edit things, you throw things away, you leave it. You can even leave it for a month and then come back and read it fresh, and you've forgotten what you've written. So you'll get that same reaction that someone would get who's never read it before. And you'll think, oh, that was really stupid. I don't even understand what I wrote myself. Or you'll think, oh, no, that really got me in the guts. That's going to stay. So that's how I do it. I'm not on a timeline, although I probably should be, because I'm one of those types that just keep putting things off. And like, I've got a book of poetry. I've got about 100 poems, and I've whittled it down to 40. And I think I've got all the artwork done for it, but I just won't put it out. I just won't publish it, because I think, no, I can get that poem more perfect. So sometimes you're your own worst enemy, because you just won't get to the point where you feel like it's finished. And that's, you know, maybe the creative type. But at some point you've just got to think that's good enough. Yeah, it's messy, Emil. It's not clean at all. It's not, but it's enjoyable for me. Yeah.
And it's inspired. It sounds like it's inspired, something that comes from within and almost drops on you, and you have to kind of write it down. And I think the more and more I hear stories of the most successful writers, it's all about writing these ideas down. For example, Stephen King got the idea of one of his books as just a partial image of of something coming down and severing a man's hand, and he lay dormant for I think decades before he actually started to write that story. And that story, I forget what the book is called, but it was turned into a mini series, and it became one of his successful books. Not every book he writes or publishes now is successful. I think he sells probably half of the market when it comes to any types of books that sell. But out of interest, have you read Stephen King's book on writing? That's what it's called.
I have read bits and pieces of it, but I haven't read the whole thing, no.
It's an interesting idea because he walks through his process of putting ideas down, and in a later interview he kind of mimics or reflects what he's kind of getting to in the book. And this is a very cynical view of writing that he has in this statement, but it's one that's stuck with me forever. He says, plot writing is the last resort of very bad writers.
I need to tell Matt this, because he was trying to tell me that plot is everything, and I was trying to tell him, no, it's character. Okay, I'm going to throw this back in his face. I'm really excited you told me this.
It's such I love it. I love his reflection, because this is the most successful, I would say the most successful writer in history in terms of the quantity of what he has written, what it's sold, and the type of, like, he made clowns scary. Like before his book, it was published in the 80s, clowns were a fun thing. You know, they came to your party, they did practical jokes, tricks, they entertained you in circuses, and then he comes along with Pennywise and turns it on its head. Bloody hell. And then generations of kids.
You know, my favorite Stephen King quote that I ever heard him say was, he said, "I have the heart of a small boy, and it's sitting in a jar on my desk."
Oh.
I just love, he just takes it in a different direction. I just love it. Yeah. He's very, very good writer. Just picturing it now, isn't it? It's just so creepy.
I don't even know what to say to that. Gosh. Oh,
yeah.
Bless this guy. He's remarkable. What's your favorite Stephen King book?
Oh, well, yeah, I can't go past it, even though it's such a creepy story. I don't know why I'm drawn to this, the things that I almost don't want to admit that I'm drawn to. It's just so weird and creepy, and maybe it.
Can I give you perhaps a reason why? I cover this very briefly in my book.
Are you going to psychologize me right now?
I'll psychologize myself, and then we'll see if you can pick up on the themes that I'm psychologizing. So as I started to read Stephen King's after I started studying psychology and psychotherapy and doing a lot of counseling work, and now I realize why I love those themes. In the same way that Harry Potter, I never read Harry Potter growing up, but I read them as an adult, and I know why I love the books that I love. For example, my favorite Harry Potter book is The Prisoner of Azkaban, and there's a reason why I love that book, and I'll get to that soon. But Stephen King, what he does very, very masterfully is that he puts control back into the children through an imaginative process to overcome the monster. And you see this in It predominantly. You see this in It, where when they're able to laugh at the monster gets smaller and smaller and weaker, and only when they are laughing at it, belittling it, making it the way it is, they got control, and then they kill it.
Wow. You should do this for a living. That is amazing. I never really knew that. I didn't realize that before. Yeah, well, that's true. Wow.
You see it all the time with his kids' books, books with kids in them. Like, for example, Dr. Sleep is a sequel to The Shining. Have you read that book?
No, I've seen the movie, but not the book.
Yeah, movie doesn't compare. The book is bloody amazing. When you look at the book, he does the same thing there. He puts the control back into the girl to infiltrate the evil top hat wearing villain, to go into her mind, to access her memories, to change them around, to make herself the warrior with a sword, and just going around and killing what's inside that villain's mind. She's changed her idea of who she is, and she infiltrates the mind of the villain because she can control minds, and she's made herself as a person who's just going through destroying everything. And he does that bloody masterfully.
And see, it's the character arc that I would have been attracted to in that, because it's how she's overcome something or how she's changed. So if a character doesn't go through that transformative process, you're not going to be drawn to the story, the movie, unless it's something like Fast and the Furious, and you're only going to watch it to see how much more ridiculous it can get, which is something I love secretly. I don't know why.
Oh gosh, I gave up probably after Too Fast, Too Furious.
You know what? I'm so far into it now. I've seen them all, that if more come out, I just have to see it to tick a box. Yeah.
That's the way.
But I was gonna say, they keep coming out, don't they? I was gonna say though, there's a great app, and you pay about $280 a year for it, but it's called the Masterclass app, and I only use it to access all the writers on there. But you can access anything from cooking to sport to all the greats will coach you on there. But R.L. Stine is on there from Goosebumps, and just listening to the way he wrote, and his process is completely different to someone like Stephen King, is completely different to someone like her name's escaping me now, but she wrote The Handmaid's Tale.
Yep,
and
I know who you're talking about. Yeah,
I don't know why I can't remember her name at the moment, but
Margaret something.
Yep. Atwood. Margaret Atwood. And there's screenwriters on there. There's all these different types of people, and I'm telling you, it's the best education you'll ever get. You don't need to pay for a uni degree. Just go and listen to the app, and you'll get gold. You'll just absolutely get gold, and you just take from it what you want.
Yeah.
That's the other thing. There's so much advice out there. I think listen to everything and then do what you want, because create your own way of doing it. If you're going to be a new thing, if you're going to be a new artist or writer or whatever it is, why would you want to be exactly the same as other people? It's not going to work, because you're just going to copy. So I really want, especially children, just to be themselves, because there's only one you, and I think we get scared by that, but I think we should get excited by that there's only one of us. Yeah.
There's a reason why we're drawn to that character development, and it's often the stories that bring about finding that which is within that you have had all along. Kind of what you're talking about in your story, Eggs, where we're able to access something that we didn't think we could access before, until a situation of terror forces us to do this. And this is why I was telling you beforehand that these lockdowns, I'm very conflicted about these lockdowns over the past years. And I told you before we done this interview that they've been the worst and the best times of my life. I was talking with my wife about it yesterday, and I'm very conflicted. It's the worst thing I've ever experienced in terms of this dystopian Orwellian nightmare that we appear to be going into. And yet I have only become a better version of myself. Friedrich Nietzsche said this. He said, "Become who you are." And for the longest bloody time, EJ, I had no idea what that meant. It said, that quote sat with me for years without me knowing why it sat with me. And then it's almost as if I woke up and I came to the conclusion, at least for me, that the person who I am becoming is not a static thing. Who I am is not static, which is why there's the verb there, become. I don't know if that's a verb. I hope it's a verb, or I might have screwed up in that sense. So you're becoming who you are in a process of discovery. Mm-hmm. You are not a constant entity. And so when a person, at least the way that I look at it, when a person says, that's just the way that I am, it shows more of a limiting mindset, what psychologists call a fixed mindset, instead of what psychologists like Carol Dweck, who did most of the research on this, call a growth mindset. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And yeah, just to dovetail back into, I don't know if dovetail's the right word, I don't know, more like spearhead back into the conversation that you'd mentioned. Going into a person's process, for example, like R.L. Stein, who does things completely different to what Stephen King does, or even what C.S. Lewis did in his books, for example, in his book, Screwtape Letters, if you've ever read that.
About that, I've read that, yeah.
Oh God, man, that's a deathly confronting book if you let it be. Mm-hmm. Everyone's got their own process and everyone does the best that they can do with that process. And I always go back to it. In this time, we've got to understand that everyone is doing the best that they think they can with what they have. Unless you're psychopathic or narcissistic or sociopathic, which it's really interesting because we can throw labels at people without really knowing why those labels exist. But oftentimes people, just the ordinary person's doing the best they can with what they have.
Yeah. I remember, I think it was Brene Brown said that. Is that her name? Is that how you pronounce her name?
I know Brene Brown, yeah. But
yeah, I remember her. Yeah, I remember her asking the question, do you think everybody is doing the best that they can? And my initial thought was, no, I don't. I don't think everybody's doing the best that they can. But then after listening to her, I mean, everyone has a different capacity. Everyone has a different threshold for stress. Some people, are just hanging on. Other people are thriving in lockdown. I know I'm exactly the same as you. I feel like it's been the worst 2 years and in some other ways the best 2 years. And it's very strange because you think, would I wish it away? Yes and no. But there's just been so much broken, and I sort of think, I imagine a tree being like a rose bush being completely stripped back, which I saw some people do. They bought a house in a street near me, and the first thing they do was cut the rose bush back almost to the little stumps. And I thought, oh no, all those rose bushes have just been destroyed, but they left the tiniest little stub at the end, and now being spring again, you should see these trees because the roots have gone deeper, and that's why the trees are stronger. But watching them cut them back just looked horrible, and it just looked so stark for so long. But before you know it, it's spring again, and that's the hope that I've got for after lockdown. It's a little bit scary because I feel like it's just dragging on. I just never imagined it would drag into 2022. But wars have gone for 5 or 6 years at a time, and you come out the other side. Like I just think going to sit in a cafe with a cup of tea and scrambled eggs with some friends, to me, that's sunshine. That's just like the most amazing thing, but I would probably take that for granted before.
Yes.
So I think a bit of simplicity, not needing as much, being grateful for the people in your life. It throws you right back, and you can be happier with less. But in order to get there, it's been a horrible process, but maybe worth it. I don't really want to answer that because there's been people who wouldn't have the same feeling, especially some of the comments on some of the clips I did with Matt. We talked about this, and 50% say, yep, it's the best 2 years, and other people said, I'm in depression, I've lost everything. So yeah, it's a hard thing to gauge. I don't really know how to answer it.
It really is. And that's why there's a theologian by the name of Tim Mackey, and he's based in the States, and he talks, I love the way that he put together his answers. Whenever he's asked questions, he says, I don't have answers, but I do have responses. And he hesitates to use the word answer because answer is so final. It's almost like this is what it is. Just like the earth is flat was the answer to how the earth constituted itself until I think it was Aristotle who was the first to measure the curvature of the earth by, I think what he did, he put two different measures on two different distances and then measured I want to say the light as it hit one compared to the other, and you would be able to see the curvature of it. I could have got that completely wrong, but what we have as people, and especially as a counselor, and I say this to myself, I have responses to many things, but whether I have the answer is a little bit more difficult. Like, we know the answer to the way blood plays its tricks within our bodies, that it circulates. Blood circulates as an answer to how the cardiovascular system operates, in essence. Yet there are many responses that we can kind of come up with, which would sit on many different sides of the question, I would say. Mm-hmm. And that's why it's a bit more nuanced, a bit more difficult to come up with something.
Well, I don't think we can sort of be blamed for that. I don't think we've been through anything like this before, especially our generation. We've just been the lucky country, and we've never had to fight for freedom. It's always just been there. So I'm hoping, I'm optimistic that it will make us better, and moving forward. It's just that we happen to be in it right now. We're writing that horrible chapter that no one wants to write, but we have to play our part in it. We're in it, so you have to embrace it. I don't know what else there is to do, really, because and that's the sort of strength that you start getting that you didn't know was in you, which is going to be something you can't get any other way. It's not like you can just imagine that you would be strong in a situation. Once you put through it, you know that you are, and that hopefully will carry on in life with you forever and make you a better person. Got all deep on you there, sorry.
You did a good job. I think we're just starting to put in the roots of a really deeper conversation that we really need to address in terms of hope. Hope in itself is an expectation that things will improve. Mm-hmm. At its practical essence, that's what hope espouses in us. And that's why when we have people with severe depression, our psychological inventories ask us to measure hopelessness and helplessness, because they're the two main predictors of whether a person is more or less likely to consider suicide and then move forward from that. Mm-hmm. When we look around us today, hope it's so individual that what I may draw hope from can be something completely different than you, EJ, or than the person across the road, your neighbor, your parent or sibling, or what have you. Let's look at kids, because kids have been one of the most impacted in terms of schooling, and that's your gig. I mean, when it comes to kids, that's where you lie. What words do you have to say about the things that kids have endured, and any interesting side articles to that?
Um, Look, it worries me because they're in the developmental stage of figuring out the way they see the world. And, you know, I've got a whole happy childhood behind me to know that it's not always going to be like this, but they don't. So I think, I don't think we're going to see the impacts of this for a while. I think it'll, you know, there'll be a knock-on effect that might even be immeasurable at some point. But yeah, I think trying to keep their life as normal as possible, with routine, with purpose, with fun, with silliness, with imagination, you know, try and do all of those things. But if you're the parent who's going through this tough time yourself, you know, you need to pull even deeper strength out to be there for your children. But then on the flip side, maybe that's where your strength is coming from, you know, to keep it together for them. So it depends on how you want to see it, I suppose. But I was thinking about how the brain, and you'll know obviously about this, how the brain mapping is done from ages birth to 7 or 8, where those things like, can I trust people? Am I good at things? Do I have hope? All of those sort of foundational ideas of the world are set by about 7 years old. And so because those things are happening at that age, even if they pass 7 and then they, you know, learn that it's not always going to be that way, I'm wondering if they're going to have these sort of memories playing in the background of the masks on their face and the playgrounds with the chains on them and all that sort of thing. So, you know, would you look back to children of war? You know, like my grandmother's 83 and she will still talk about the war, you know, from when she was a 6-year-old. She'll still talk about the bombs flying overhead or hiding under the table at school.
Wow.
So again, if we can't take it away, I think we have to have a process to, a healthy process of talking about it, putting it somewhere, building from it and moving forward, because it's not going anywhere. And I don't know how much longer the lockdown of school, the in and out, the disruption is going to keep going. So yeah, I mean, it's not, I don't, like I said, I don't have the answer, but I have responses, and they're just sort of the questions that I've got at the moment for children. Yeah.
And this is where it begins, when we're able to ask questions about what's happening. That's I'm going to butcher this quote, but George Orwell said something to the effect of, when we live in a society where the truth is so fleeting, then the mere act of telling the truth becomes a revolutionary act. And within the process of asking a question, there's a genuine, it's almost like you're espousing a genuineness of saying something doesn't make sense. You're vulnerable enough to ask that question, or defiant enough to ask that question, or you are driven by something deeper than just going with the flow. And you may be able to relate to this, but as well, I've never been one to go with the flow in my own life. I'd always been pushing boundaries, asking questions, and I see that in my own children. In fact, some of the questions that are my kids asked me were the same questions that I'd asked my parents and never got a response to. And within the process of asking questions, it shows that you trust at least the person that you are asking the question to, or you trust that the process of asking the question will create a movement, at least an intellectual movement, to hold a person or a infrastructure accountable. So this is a really, I mean, we could go a little bit deeper in that, but I want to stay, real back to it. And what have been the most surprising things that you've found just throughout this whole process, from your I guess even asking questions around kids and development and their own ways that they engage in, say, something like risky play or kind of moving forward with boundaries. I know you studied and your thesis was on risky play from what we've spoken about before. Do you want to tell our audience a little bit about that?
Sure. So risky play is categorized, there's 6 categories of risky play. So there's height, which would be like climbing a tree or dangling from the monkey bars. There's speed, so flying down on the billy cart or skateboard or your bike. Elements, which is being around water and fire, like a fire pit or a swimming pool. You've got tools, which would be hammer and nails. It could even be, you know, in a 2-year-old sense, it would be a very pointy stick. Look out, they're going to poke someone's eye out with that. And then you've got rough and tumble play, which is especially important for boys' development. But, you know, just that roughing each other up and rolling around and even dad coming home and throwing you high in the air after, you know, you've had dinner and please don't vomit on me. That sort of, you know, rough and tumble stuff. But also, and then the last one, or one of the 6, is being out of sight. So that the knowing that you're on your own, whether that's in, you know, you're in a bedroom with the door shut and you're just by yourself, or you're walking down to the milk bar for the first time without anybody with you, hiding in a cubby house playing hide and seek. You know, just who am I in the world on my own? There's no one watching me right now if I got in trouble. So those sorts of internal, what's developed internally when you go through those sorts of things is learning your own capability, trusting your instincts, testing your ability to, your physical ability, but also, you know, inner strength to how close can I get to this? How hot is that? How close is the edge? You know, just learning yourself in the real world and not an artificial world. It's really important. Nature is being lost, you know, especially with artificial setups in, say, early learning centres. For example, early learning centres in the yard, it's just flat, you know, like outside, and there's children growing up on flat ground. So let's say they're full-time childcare children and they're spending 10 hours a day on flat ground while their feet are developing. There's this phenomenon of children just falling over their own feet for no reason. And it's because they're not walking on little dips and hills and, you know, just the normal way that grass is and land is. They're just in this artificial world. And people, my sister works for the NDIS, who give out funding for children with issues, you know, disabilities or special needs or just a whole range of things. And children are just tripping over their own feet, and they were thinking that it might be their eyesight, but it's actually just an inability of spatial awareness and depth perception. And you can see this in kinder as well, when you ask children to come and sit on the mat and we're going to do a story time, a child would just come and sit on top of another child. They didn't even realize they were there. It's just this unbelievable thing that we're not growing up with normal just abilities to recognize depth, shadow. You know, we've always got the iPhone or the iPad in our face, children in prams, which I was saying on Matt's show is not going to be able to, you're not going to be able to read traffic 4 cars ahead when you're an 18-year-old if you've had your face in a screen for your whole life and things like that. So just being in the natural world and understanding it as much as possible is really important. So with these lockdowns and taking away playgrounds, that was the thing that really got my goat. And I'm not like worried about saying it all. I went and ripped down all of the tape off the playgrounds because that was the thing that just got me. I thought, you've taken away their socialization, you've taken away school, you've taken away routine, normalizing, you've taken away, you know, parents who probably didn't have depression and now they do, and now they're worrying about paying the bills, and then you're going to take away a swing set as well. You know, I just, it infuriated me. So
Mm.
it's really the lockdown. It's going to affect children in lots of different ways. And like I said, I can't know. It's going to be interesting to look back. But even children now that I've known, 2 children across the road from me, both of them have been born in lockdown, and they've never known life without people wearing masks. I mean, when they see my face without a mask on, they almost just stare at me like I'm some sort of alien. Or there's a child down the street further than me who's always been very social and now hides behind mum and dad when people walk past because we're allowed out again, and he doesn't know how to navigate, normal interaction of people. Or the mother was even telling me going down to Woolworths just to do some shopping. It was overstimulating for him. So, a language development, seeing people's face move instead of behind the mask. There's going to be a whole range of things coming up in the future.
On that point, I notice I've got to be careful how I kind of phrase this one, because there's an interesting. I'm cautious about not advising people to go around and break laws, but then I'm also, there's another part of me that's like, well, evil laws. What's the most moral thing to do in those situations? And so what I've noticed is that children whose parents would follow every single rule and every single guideline, they're the ones that have experienced their children being the most impacted. Whereas, for example, my children, we did everything, it wasn't, and I noticed that even though they were affected, they were nowhere near as affected as other people were afterwards. And they were very, very social. When we went down to our parks, you would still see probably still about 10, or let's use the 20% principle that you talked about. 20% of the capacity of that playground is still there. It's still full. You've still got kids playing in the playground, and I very purposely made sure that this was something that my children do not miss out on, just because of what was happening at the time. It's heartbreaking. Yes.
Can I give you an example of governing body stupidity, and then you can understand why I think parents need to make up their own mind. So the Heart Foundation will tell children not to eat all of their lollies at one time. Say you get a bag of lollies from a party. Don't eat all the lollies at one time. It's sugar overload. It's not good for your heart, right? And they'll come in and they'll do, like a presentation to kids about the Heart Foundation and looking after your body. Then the next week you'll have the dentist come in and do a talk on, make sure you eat all your lollies at the same time, because you don't want all of that sugar swirling around in your teeth and in your gums all throughout an 8-hour day. It's better to eat them all at the one time and then wash it down with water to make sure your teeth are healthy. So you've got these 2 governing bodies, or 2 pieces of health advice coming at you, and they say the completely opposite thing. So at the end of the day, you have to make up your own mind and use your own brain, do your own research, and be okay with your own decision. And if that meant ripping down some tape and pushing a child on a swing because it's better for their mental health, and I might cop a fine or I might get yelled at by someone, well, then that's just what I'm going to do. And nobody wants to be in this position, though. And I think it's Topher Field who was saying that good people break bad laws. And at some point, we're all going to have differing opinions about what those laws, what's a good law, what's a bad law. But that's why I don't judge other people for wearing a mask. I don't wear one, but if that's what you want to do to feel more calm, and maybe you've got anxiety and that actually helps you, and maybe you've got a child who's asking to wear a mask. Like, I don't know, I can't stand it when I see a mask on a child, but maybe that child is wanting to wear one and I don't know the reason behind it. So I'm just trying to keep you know, my opinions to myself, but at the same time, I just wish it would all go back to normal.
There's 3 points I want to pick up on on what you said. Topher Field was reflecting on, I think it was Malcolm X, who was a African-American freedom fighter at the time for equal rights, who said it's something to the effect of, it is your natural imperative, your moral imperative for a good person to break a bad law. It's not just, you know, good people tend to break bad laws, but there's a moral imperative to it. To the point that if say let's do an extreme. I love extremes because we can at least create almost like an archetype of this, how this might look like. If you were hiding a Jew in, say, your basement back in World War II days, and you get a knock at the door and asking, is there any Jews living here? You've got 2 choices. You've got to break your moral imperative on truthfulness or on keeping life. And so do you lie in that situation? Does your lie become negated by the life you are saving? Or do you tell the truth? And then some people would have told the truth and say, it's up to God what happens after that, but I've done my thing. But no, you haven't. What you've done is you've sentenced somebody to death by doing that. Mm-hmm. And perhaps even sentenced yourself and your family to death for hiding them in the first place. It's a very, very difficult one. And that's where we get a bit more philosophical in terms of our moral imperatives. That's one. The other interesting part was, one of my colleagues told me this. When we have a sense to say something because we may either be excited by something we feel like we need to tell somebody else, or we don't agree with what somebody else is doing, we feel the need to say something, you've got to balance yourself by asking yourself these 3 questions. Does it need to be said? Does it need to be said by me? And does it need to be said right now? I think these are really important questions to ask ourselves, because regulating your impulses when you see what's happening around you is a very difficult thing for many people to do, including myself. And there was another point that I wanted to make, but I forgot that point because my mind went to the other 2. It's always that.
You know what? I'll admit this. When, like last year, when I wasn't wearing a mask and I was yelled at so many times by people, I used to just think, just keep walking. Why do you care what I'm doing? You've got your mask on. You're not anywhere near me. What's the problem? But now that you don't have to wear a mask outside, and I'm still seeing people choose to do it, I have an urge to say something to them. And so I don't do it though. I don't say anything, but I just want to say, why are you continuing this? Take it off. But then why do I have the right to tell that person? Like, so I'm almost empathizing with the people who abused me a year ago, because I understand they thought I was crazy. Now I think they're crazy. And but that's just the discord and the chaos that's been caused by the government. So I'm trying not to put my feelings towards other people and keep it where it's meant to stay, which is with the government. Not everyone's just affected by it differently, and we're all just sort of victims in it, I guess. But yeah, I was going to say something too, Emil, and I've totally lost my train of thought.
I'm sure it will come back. Both of us will come back probably when the interview ends and we're out doing other things. In particular, I covered this in a question that I was asked on Instagram in terms of groupthink and these cognitive biases that we have. Humans, if we take an evolutionary point of view, we understand that humans operate in terms of group identity from at one level. Now, that's not, if we categorize ourselves as I am what my group espouses, and that becomes really, really bad. But we have evidence back into the 1950s where it was a really interesting study done where they got 20 Anglo-American children from middle-class families that were Protestant and put them into a camp called the Robbers Cave, in the Robbers Cave National Park in Oklahoma, in the States. And they basically just split these kids into two groups, so about 10 or 12 years old. And then they got them to name their groups. And one of the groups were called the Rattlers. The other group was called the Eagles. And then they separated them, and then they did a whole bunch of activities within their own groups. And then they started to bring the groups together and started to see how they interacted. And would you believe it? Very predictable. They started to create their own identities around we're the better group. Mm-hmm. And these guys, we need to mess with these guys. And then these kids started to do things like eat the other kids' meals. If one group of kids came back later, it went so far that one group raided the other group's cabin and started overturning the mattresses and taking their stuff. They even got into fistfights, and the psychologists had to intervene around what was going on over there. And they called off the experiment. And what was seen is that established a historical theory of these group identities that we get into, even though we are the same in essence. We come from the same neighborhoods, same ages, same religious persuasions, same socioeconomic status, and yet just because we see ourselves as belonging to one group or another, we have this attack.
Wow. Well, that explains Melbourne right now. What camp are you in? What side are you on? Gee. You know, that reminds me of another experiment. I don't even know where I'm going with this, but you've just reminded me of an experiment they did with children where they put them in like a big paddock, I suppose, a big grass area, and they built a circular fence around it, and they said, you can play anywhere inside this fence, you just can't go over the fence. And that was the only instruction given to them. So what ended up happening was these children went right to the first thing they did was run right to the fence, and they were sitting on it, dangling off it, like hanging their arms through it. All they wanted to do was get as close to the boundary as possible and push that boundary. Then they did the same experiment, but they had no fence. And they said, you can play anywhere you want on this open field. And the children really didn't wander that far. They could see that it just went on and on and on and on. And so they didn't want to be too far from each other's sight. And what it made me think was, you know, and this is my personality, the more boundaries you put on people, the more laws, the more rules, the more no you can't, the more we feel like we want to escape. Like, for example, you know, making things mandatory, that just makes me not want to do it. But if it's voluntary and you give me education and you give me respect of making my own decision and giving me good reasons why, and then leaving it up to me, I am much more likely to take you up on whatever it is that you're asking of me, but not demanding of me, because, you know, if it becomes a free choice, then you're the one who doesn't feel like there's a boundary, so you don't really want to run that far. But I found that fascinating because it was a physical example of put in a boundary, people will push it. Don't put in a boundary, and it's trusting. It was a trust thing in the children. Don't run so far that we can't see you anymore, and they didn't want to anyway. So I think that's the other big thing that I think is missing, is that the government don't trust us to make our own judgments and our own decisions, and we do feel like we're being treated like children, which is probably why so many people are acting like children. Sort of just a bit of it's a bit of chaos. Absolutely.
You're onto something there, EJ. And the interesting thing, they brought up two memories for me. The Garden of Eden, where you're put into the middle of the garden and said, you can do anything you want except just don't touch that tree. You know, and the first thing they do is go around, Adam and Eve touch that tree, eat from the fruit, and kind of go from there. This is a story as old as stories have been around, and it's an archetype of disobedience in a sense, but at the same time it shows a complete lack of human nature on the part of the government when they enacted these types of rules, where if you were to understand human nature a little bit, perhaps you need to take some courses in psychology or child or human development to get into some to get into politics. Maybe that would give you a better sense of what's going on, or perhaps you should have owned a business at some point so you can understand the people that you're kind of catering towards. Or maybe you just need to read a bit of Dostoevsky or something to really get a sense of how psychology infiltrates within a person. I want to give a bit of hope though, because it's really important that we have hope during this time. And I wanted to do that by circling back to the Robbers Cave experiment, because the psychologists didn't stop there. What the psychologists did was they wanted to understand what would it take for these kids to start getting along with each other again. And so what they did is they devised some activities for these kids. And what they did was they got them to pool their money together and purchase a movie that they were going to be paying. And none of them by themselves had enough money to have that movie shown. But together they had the money to show the movie. So they pooled the money, they watched the movie. Another experiment, another activity that they did was that there was a camp truck that was bogged. And so what they had done is they fastened some ropes around the truck, and they asked all the kids to pull the truck from where it was stuck. And they had to all work together to pull that truck out. Mm-hmm. And another thing that they did, and I took only about the 3 things that they did, was the water reservoir that was feeding water into the camp broke. And so they had to work together to find a way to fix that reservoir for water to come back into the camp. And would you know it, after they worked on these, what they called superordinate goals, is superordinate meaning outside or external to oneself, they started to sit together at lunchtime. They stopped calling each other names. They started to play with each other more. And they started to get along. It's a really interesting outcome there, because what we have is division, but what we don't have is these superordinate goals that will bring both camps, so to speak, together. But the superordinate goal is, let's get rid of this virus. And that's the only superordinate goal, rather than let's function collectively as a society so that we can operate.
Because the end goal is the same, which is a great thing that we have the same end goal, but we all think we're going to get there in a different way. The only strategy I have at the moment is to be the nicest person in the world without a mask on, no matter how much I'm yelled at, because it's not going to work any other way. So somebody has to be the bigger person and not get into the fight and the argument, and I'm going to try and do that and just, walk away from it or whatnot. I don't really have the energy for it anyway, but not sure. I'm not sure, because there's 2 very different camps here. And I know a lot of people not in my camp who just cannot understand the way I think, and vice versa. So I think being respectful of each other's feelings is probably the best place to start. Just being civil listening and the dialogue. You know, let's not censor, let's talk, and let's keep having the conversation, because I think when the conversation stops and we're not allowed to talk anymore, that's when we're in trouble, because we can't communicate, obviously.
I think that's a perfect place to end, EJ. I really appreciate your time today. You've been very generous with your time, and I want to give you the opportunity to tell our listeners where they can find you, where they can purchase these amazing books, and if there's anything else, any other place they can look for you. And before I do that, I'll just ask, do you have anything as an ending, anything that you wanted to say but you haven't said yet?
Look, just a tip for people who are interested in risky play. If you want to look at some heart-stopping stuff, go and look up Anji Play, which is spelled ANJI. It's a 700-strong kindergarten in China of children, and it's the most amazing risky play you've ever seen in your life. And it's just it's starting to take over the world. It's a new sort of phenomenon. So that would be one thing. Another thing is anything to do with Finland and the way they do early childhood in Finland. That would be my dream for Australia, to do early childhood that way. So if anyone is interested in that area, those are my two sort of favourite places to look. But as for finding me, my website is just ejcarroll.com, and it's RRL. Always have to spell that one out. And my books, all of my books are on there. I've got so many resources on there for Eggs and Melancholy Dolly. If you're a teacher, there's literacy, maths, games. You won't have to do planning for at least a term, so they're all free. So I've designed all those. Yeah, you can have access to that. And you can find me on Instagram and Facebook, and all those links are on my website anyway.
Thank you so much for coming on today, EJ. And perhaps we'll have you on board again in the future and continue these discussions. Keep up the great work that you're doing.
You too. Thanks, Emil.